I'll give you a few suggestions on what to think about as you complete each different section. One of the sections will be on the critical review. This is often quite a difficult part of the report to complete, so I'll be offering a few suggestions of what you can cover in that. And I'll also be pointing you to the description. As we go through the lecture, I'd just like you to kind of have a paper and pen ready, just to jot a few things down as we go along. Because what I'm really trying to do is to give you a few suggestions and then ask if you can apply those suggestions to your particular project, which is a very individual thing, and then we'll move on to the next part of the lecture. So let's see how we go with that. Okay, so just a quick show of hands, please, of who's taking a design project and a build project. A few. Anyone doing a research project? 2. Okay, so that's quite unusual. There's a few with research projects. So what I'll do is, a lot of the slides say design and build because those are specifically aimed at design and build. What I'll try to do is point to how the research bit might be different as we go through. So that's very helpful to know. And as I go through also, I'll point out the specific issues for design projects and for build projects that you should look out for. Okay, so having a look at the projects so far, you've all been working away on your individual projects. You've all handed in a project proposal at the start. That was worth 10%. And then everyone did an early project demo, 5%. You get 5% for interaction with your supervisor and general project management. And I'm sure you've all been checking in regularly with your supervisor, getting lots of good advice. And then we come on to the project report and the Viva. So the project report is worth 70% of the marks, and that's why it's so crucial that you give yourself enough time to complete it. So it's a very common feeling that when you're doing a project, you want to keep working away on the project, trying to make it better and better, and then you slightly run out of time to make the most of the report. But it's very important to remember that the report counts for a lot of marks, and so it's important to give it enough time and to give it enough focus. Okay, so when we're looking at what makes a good report, there's the standard things that you need to consider, the guidelines that are in the module guide, like how long it should be, what the presentation style should be, but I'm sure you're all aware of that. You'll also be aware of the mark breakdown. So for design projects, the main section is design and the analysis, as you'd expect. And then for build projects, the main section is the implementation, followed by the design and the testing. So testing becomes a very important area as well in build projects. And for research projects, the experiments, evaluation and results analysis are also very important and attract the major amounts of the marks, as I'm sure you'll be aware. Could you just tell me which area your research projects are in?
Cybersecurity.
Cybersecurity.
Yes.
And okay, so 2 cybersecurity. Anyone else doing research projects? Who's just come in? You're either design or build. Okay, thank you. So you'll be focusing, depending on your project, you'll be focusing on specific sections more than others, but it's very important to address all sections in the report. So markers are looking to give you as many marks as we can. But we can only award marks if you're covering all of the sections. So bear that in mind. Okay, so having a think about the introduction of the reports, let's have a think of what needs to be in your introduction and how it relates to your specific project. So the introduction is really a bit of the report that you can set the scene for your project. You can help to direct the reader through your report and the introduction, and you can explain what else is going on. Not in a very detailed way, but you can give the reader a flavour of what's going on. So in the introduction, you would give an overview of your project. What does your project do? What is it about? You'll explain the problem that you're looking to solve, what's your key contribution, and what process are you going to use to solve it. So you might have a focus on a particular design element in order to solve your problem, and so that's something you can emphasise in the introduction. You should provide some background on your project to state the context of the work. So, as I said before, you need to do this. You'll be going into a lot more detail in the literature review, but in the introduction you should still try to flag to the reader what's the context of your project, how does it fit within the field, just so they know where your project sits in the general literature. The aims and objectives are something that you should state very clearly in the introduction. The aims and objectives are really a key part of your project, in particular to help the reader understand what your project is setting out to do. So the aims and objectives are really like the framework of your project, and you'll be able to talk about your aims and objectives in the critical review at the end of the report. So I just want to take a short sort of 30 seconds to a minute, not very long, but I just want you to quickly jot down a few of your aims and objectives. You will have already thought of this at the start when you were doing your project proposal, but it's just so that we can refer back to them at the end of the lecture. It's just for you to think about the aims and objectives. What are the aims and objectives in your project? Just jot them down so that they're clear for you. So I'll just give you a minute, no longer to do that. Okay, so you've all jotted down a couple of aims and objectives, and we'll come back to those at the end of the lecture. So just hold on to those for a moment. So if we just think about finally what should the introduction section do, it should really, by the end of the time the reader has read your project report, the reader should be clear on what your project is all about, and they should also be clear on how your report is structured. So in a way, you're looking to orient the reader. They should know what they're expecting in the report. They should know what problem you're looking to solve, and they should know how you're going to report that through the different sections. Okay, so do people feel fairly confident about the introduction? Kind of know what you're aiming for. So I want to move on to the literature review, just do a little bit on that. this is really a chance for you to go into more depth. You will have just oriented the reader to the field and what's out there in the introduction. In the literature review, it's an opportunity for you to go into more detail, and it's a way that you can put your work into context with the rest of the field. So what you're particularly looking to do is to show what your main contribution to the field is in your project. So you've been working on a project now for some months, and you've also had lots of other assignments to do, lots of general lectures to do. So it's quite difficult to make a big breakthrough and contribute something major to the field, but you will have been able to contribute a little bit to the field in terms of how your work, in a way, does something a little bit different to what other people are doing. So your literature review should be able to show what all the things are that are going on in the field, in your defined area, and it should show how your work is a little bit different or the same as other work in the field. So you might want to review similar systems. So for example, if you were doing a project to build a website on energy efficiency, for example, you could review the other websites on energy efficiency. You could see what features they have and maybe collect those features in the table, reference each of those different systems. Maybe some have got literature on them, and you could reference that and talk about the main features. And you would be able to compare then your energy efficiency website to those ones. And so by doing that, you've set your work into context with the field, and you've shown how your work is sometimes similar, but sometimes it's a little bit different. And you may be able to show how you've made a contribution to plugging a gap in the field, if you like. The literature review should also summarise previous work, so it should kind of give a very short overview of the history of that area. As usual, you should consider lots of sources. I'm sure you're all aware of this. You should be not just using textbooks and websites, but also journal papers, conference papers, and other peer-reviewed sources. So those are really good to show a range of sources in your literature review. I think you're all aware that if your web entries are not peer-reviewed, then you shouldn't rely on those, but I think that's common knowledge. Okay, so the other things that we should try to aim to do in the literature review are to make sure that you demonstrate critical analysis. So to demonstrate critical analysis, it's important to take the validity of the sources into account. Are your sources reliable? Some will be more reliable than others. It's important to critique work that you review, what was good about certain pieces of work and what was not so good, suggest improvements, just in a way, just try to identify any shortcomings in other work, if possible, and also talk about the good points and maybe points that you might incorporate into your system by having a look at the literature. And as always, have a look at Harvard referencing style and make sure you're using that very accurately and in an appropriate citation, appropriate method for citation. Okay, so I just want to give you another minute now to have a think about how your project fits within the context of the field. So you've thought about your aims and objectives. Now just write down a couple of sentences to just, in a way, when you come to write your report, to just remind you what you should be looking at. What are the main comparisons that you will make in your project to other systems in the field? It's a very individual thing. So I'll just give you, again, a minute to just jot down a note on that. Okay, so to just focus the literature review over a little bit more towards the research projects, the literature review will be quite an important element of your research project reports, where you'll be, in a way, not only reviewing other similar systems, but also their performance, and possibly comparing your performance against them at the end of the report. Have you got a clear idea of what you'll be comparing your systems against? Yeah, and could you give us a few examples of those?
So I've looked into a few, because mine based on authentication project.
Yeah,
So I've looked into third-party authentication applications.
yeah.
I'm trying to compare advantages, disadvantages of using them.
Okay,
What I can
great.
implement in my own one.
Okay, so looking at third-party authentication systems and looking at advantages and disadvantages. Anyone else got another method of, another set of systems that they're comparing against? A nice example?
Is it just for research or
For design or build or research?
I'll be doing comparison for my project with apps like Uber, Deliveroo, and these sort of apps.
Okay, great. So you'll be comparing other apps which do a similar purpose to your one that you're proposing. And what's that?
So I'm proposing to have a live tracker for delivery drivers.
Right.
So the managers and customers will be able to track the drivers where they are or move.
Okay, so great. So a live tracker for people who own companies and want to know where the drivers are. Okay, so great. So comparing to similar systems and looking at advantages and disadvantages. Perfect. Okay, so that sounds great that you'll be able to put your work into context with the field and compare the advantages and disadvantages. So that's a really important aspect of the literature review. So moving on to the analysis and methodology section. So again, I'm just spending a brief amount of time on each section just to try and highlight the most important things that you should be concentrating on, and hopefully that will assist you as you go through the write-up. So one main thing in the reports that you can try and do that makes it very readable and takes it up to the next level in terms of marks is that you can try and feed through the report from one section to the next. So in your introduction, you'll be setting the scene for the reader, and then you will be performing a literature review, which will go into more detail. And then if you can show in your analysis section that you're using information from your literature review to guide your analysis, then that's a very nice thing to be able to show, that you're leaning on the previous section, and then results from your analysis will then feed into your design section, and so on, and then you'll show how your implementation is feeding from your design decisions. So that's one thing to bear in mind. So try and link your analysis to your literature review and try and show how your system meets the needs that maybe other systems fall short in. When you're using analysis tools like SWOT and PESTLE, that kind of thing, just make sure that you state why you're using them, what are you intending to find out with them. And when you do something like a SWOT analysis, ensure that you put a conclusion at the end of your analysis. So as well as doing the SWOT analysis, please make sure that you write a concluding paragraph to show how the SWOT analysis then feeds into your decisions in the future regarding the project. So that's a way to make the most of what you're doing in terms of analysis. And it's also nice to reference your analysis techniques to show that they're formal methods that have been published and to give a link to them. Okay, so moving on to the design section. As I said, try and feed through, show how your design section is influenced by the analysis of the problem. It's important to ensure that you show how appropriate tools have been used, and it's quite good if you refer to the descriptors to ensure that you've covered most of the techniques, and we'll look at those a bit later. So you should, we'll see examples, things like HCI, design considerations, wireframes, etc. But you should ensure that you tick all the boxes as far as the descriptor lists are concerned. Okay. The other element with the design section actually is it's important to justify all of your design decisions, often if you can find a reference as well. So if you want to, say for example, you've generated a very clean looking website, you might want to find an HCI reference to support why that's a good way to proceed in your particular situation. So everything that you do is linked to formally published literature, and your design decisions are supported in quite a clear way. Okay, so moving on to the implementation section. Sometimes it's quite difficult to decide what to include in the implementation section and what not to include. And often, for you who've been working on the projects for many months, lots of things seem quite obvious to you because you're kind of quite expert in that area. But it's quite important to show the reader just exactly what you've achieved. You've all been working really hard to achieve a really good implementation, and so it's important to bring that out in the report. One way you can do this is to highlight particularly challenging aspects of the work. So you will have all worked away, and every so often you've come across a really difficult technical challenge, and you probably had to spend extra time trying to sort that out. You've had to look in different places for a solution, and you've implemented maybe a really nice little bit of code that has helped overcome that technical challenge. So don't let that get lost in the implementation. Try to bring that out in the report and provide a snippet of code to highlight that, and maybe state why it was a technical challenge and maybe why you weren't expecting it at the start. So that's one thing you can do to illustrate to the reader your expertise in the field, if you like. Also in the implementation section, it's good to show how your requirements how you've worked towards meeting the requirements that you established in the analysis stage. So again, it's looking back and seeing what was in the previous section and showing how that's influenced what you've done in the implementation section. Okay, so in the research students implementation section, you'll have quite a lot of detail regarding experiments, tests, and I assume you'll be generating performance parameters for your systems. Is that the case? Yeah. Okay. So could you just give a short example of what your performance measures will be?
So in terms of, we're more looking in terms of the security involved in it. So making sure that the authentication goes through the necessary security protocols.
Okay.
And then retrieving it for the user as well at the same time.
Yeah. Okay. So assessing in terms of how it meets security issues. Okay, so moving on to the testing and evaluation test section. If you've got very long test tables, then you might want to include them in the appendix. Just be clear that you label in the main report, you point the reader to the correct section in the appendix. But you should try and test your system in a very thorough way, and you should also possibly try and evaluate your system in terms of the user. So it might be very useful to send out a questionnaire, maybe to a few friends, analyse the results of those questionnaires. So you can put the questionnaires in the appendix, and then you can produce an analysis of the questionnaires within the main report, and then you should be sure to comment on those results. Were they in line with what you were expecting? Were you pleased with the results? Were you disappointed? If you're disappointed, then you might have some ideas for future work. So bear those kind of things in mind in the testing section. Okay. And now moving on to this final section of the report, the critical review and conclusion. So again, as I said at the start, often this is one of the most difficult parts to write. And one of the reasons for that is that it's quite difficult to structure it at the beginning. But I hope by the end of these slides, you'll have a kind of structure that you can follow that might be helpful. So the first thing that you might want to do in the critical evaluation section, critical review section, is to evaluate if your original aims and objectives have been met. So it's not a disaster if your original aims and objectives have not been met, because often there are reasons for that. So sometimes the project won't go exactly to plan because of a specific technical challenge, and so you may have adjusted your project a little bit over to one way or another, and so perhaps you haven't met your objectives in full. But one of the reasons why it's quite useful to have clear objectives, and if possible those objectives should be SMART, which means that they'll probably be quantified, is that you can show by how much you've met those objectives. So for example, if we consider the example of the delivery driver tracking app, maybe one of your objectives is to be able to track within all the drivers within a 1 mile radius, or it's probably larger than that, but let's use 1 mile for an example. So maybe the app works quite well for a 1 mile radius, but maybe it doesn't work so well for a larger radius. And so you can say how well the app is working at tracking those drivers, and you can compare that back to your original objectives, which said maybe it wanted 100% of the drivers tracked over a 1 mile radius. So those are ways in which you can assess if your aims and objectives have been met, either in full or part. So I'm just going to give you, again, just 30 seconds or a minute. You've all jotted down some original aims and objectives. Just have a think about how you can evaluate back onto those. So just 30 minutes, just jot a few ideas down. Okay, so hopefully everyone's jotted a few ideas of how they might evaluate the system. Anyone got any good methods of evaluation? It's very clear. With the app, did that fit with your approach?
I think the example you gave might be slightly different from mine, usually get something else.
Okay, so maybe in a slightly different form.
Yeah, so if I look at my exact aim and objectives that I have, I'm just looking at my final project now.
Yeah,
So,
okay. That's good, because then it becomes sort of fairly focused on your particular project, which is good. Everyone's got very different projects.
yeah, so one of the aims is to optimize the process of delivering the food to save time and costs.
Okay, yeah.
So maybe we're able to save time, but not necessarily costs. So
Yeah.
costs in that time are going to be.
So maybe after the implementation of your app, you could evaluate how much time would be saved, and so then you can reflect on that in whether your objective has been met. So that's good. So when you complete this section, it's quite good to state the original aim or objectives. Say, for example, it was to save time and cost, and then comment on if your app has met that and how much it's met that. So that can be the first section of your literature review, just going through each of the original aims and objectives at the start. Here's some more suggestions. In your review, it's an opportunity for you to step back and look at your entire project again. So just remind the reader of what you've done in the project. It's a nice opportunity in the review to produce a short summary of the project. So again, it's a little bit like the introduction. The introduction set the scene, and the review will wrap up the project and remind the reader all of the good things that you've done. You should reflect on what would you do differently if you did the project again. So maybe you'd change the implementation method, maybe you'd expand it a little more, or sometimes people would contract the projects because it would be a more achievable scope. You should consider in the review where your project will head in the future. So this is quite a good opportunity to talk about the needs of different users. Perhaps you found that your project met the needs of one particular group of users, and in the future it could be expanded to produce to meet the needs of others. And It's also a place where you should consider any legal and ethical issues that the project has raised. So a good example of that is the act tracking. So you might want to consider how you handle data and how that fits with employment, that kind of thing. So the other thing to do in the literature, in the critical review, sorry, I've moved the wrong one, is to relate your project results to other work. So your analysis was informed by the previous work that you described in the literature review, and now you need to put your results into that context. So all the hard work that you did earlier on in the report, putting your project into context with the other field, with the other work in the field, will link forward to the critical review, and you'll be able to show how the results of your project now fit with other work in the field. So in what way have you improved over existing literature or systems? So even if it's only a very small improvement, then that's a really good point to make, and it's very important to point that out to the reader to ensure that they are aware of the contribution that you've made, because they're not going to be completely aware of the rest of the field, and so it's really good if you can show them quite explicitly what your contribution is. The other thing is to consider the whole process of your project, so of your software development, and have a think about what went wrong, what went well, where you encountered the problems, how you handled those problems. And this is why it's quite good if you've listed those already in the implementation section. You'll have highlighted technical challenges, and you can refer back to those. So you don't then in the critical review section, you don't need to spell them out in a lot of detail. You can summarise them and point the reader back to the implementation section. And don't be worried about doing that either. So feel free to summarise something in one section and point the reader back to the detail in, say, section 3.4 of the implementation. We've mentioned ethical, legal aspects. You might want to also consider social implications, consider the relationships to your client, to future users of your software. Think about any social or legal implications. Okay, so that's all I want to say about the critical review. So we've been through each section of the report now. And hopefully it's clear how the report will be a kind of continuous structure that builds on each section as you go through and takes the reader through the whole process that you've gone through, highlights the really good aspects and shows them how you know a lot of things about the field and how your work fits into the field. So are there any questions so far on that aspect? Okay, so just a couple of general points. Check the marking scheme. So the marking scheme can be a great friend to you. It will tell you what the markers are considering. So markers, we're all trying to give you a mark where we can. But we all have to stick to the marking scheme very closely. So even if you've done an amazing introduction or an amazing implementation section, we can only give you the marks that are allocated for that. And so if you haven't done much in the analysis section, then all of those marks will go. So if you can make sure that you address each of the sections really well, then you can pick up maximum marks. Remember, as I said before, use Harvard referencing scheme and implement it accurately. This is a personal choice really, but you can consider using numbered section headings. It makes it quite easy then to refer people back to appropriate sections if they need more detail, and it helps to make the structure clear. But you can have a clear structure without them. But just ensure that whatever you do, it is very clear what the hierarchy of your sections are. Try and get someone else to proofread your report as well as yourself. You should proofread it first and then give it to someone else, because it's really difficult to spot your own mistakes. I think it, especially with something like a report where you've spent a long time writing and rewriting, the mistakes become a little bit invisible, particularly spotting typos. As I said before, refer very clearly to appendices. If possible, try to give the appendix number and the page number if you've got more than one. So the descriptors and mark schemes are already on Study Space. They're in the assignment brief. Has everybody looked? Who's looked at the descriptors and the mark schemes? Okay, so some people not. So I would refer to these really closely when writing your report, because the markers will be referring to them really closely when they're marking your report.
Do you mean where it says close to expectations, met expectations, and 70-60%? Is that what it says?
Yeah, I'm going to show it. Yes, those are the mark schemes, and I'll show those in a minute, but also the descriptors. So the descriptors, I would recommend that you have those next to you when you're writing the report, because you can just check then that you've covered all the things that are mentioned in them. So there are descriptors for design and build, which is here, and the research, which is here. So if you have a look at these, you can say, for example, if you're doing a design project, you can see that you've got more areas to cover in the design section than the build project. And it's also useful for things like the introduction and the literature review. So in the design, it's a little bit more involved than the build projects. But you can check off things that are in these sections. You can check that you've got the background, the motivation. You can check that you've got the aims and objectives. You can also point to what the deliverables of your project are. So these are really useful documents. So you would just, what I would do is write your report and check that you've got everything that's mentioned in there. And if you're unsure about whether to include something or not, then discuss with your individual supervisor. So similarly, the research descriptor. So again, for you to, quite a lot of useful information. Your introduction and aims and objectives is a little bit less, but that's because they've got the full state-of-the-art review down here, which we were talking to, how you'll compare advantages and disadvantages of different systems. So those descriptors are really useful. And the final thing I just want to say, have a look at the mark schemes. So again, mark schemes for design, build and research projects. Now these are again in the assessment brief. And so any version that you refer to should be the ones from Study Space that have been uploaded by the module leader. So these ones that are included here I think are the same, but just to be sure, make sure that you view the versions on Study Space. And you'll just notice that often the difference between exceeded expectations and met expectations is that you hit every single point. So you've described everything that's mentioned in the descriptor in a really complete and thorough way. Whereas sometimes the meta expectations is that you've done that for a lot of things that are mentioned in the descriptor, but not all of them. So that's why it's really useful to go down the descriptor and just check that you've got everything. Okay. Okay, so I think that's almost it. And yeah, best of luck with writing your project report. If you've got any specific questions about this lecture in the future, then do get back to me by email or discuss with your supervisor. Are there any questions? Okay, thanks very much.